that we move on with a couple of minutes delay, but I'm sure we'll catch up, to the next and last topic, which is transparency measures. And this is very important, very dear to our heart as European Medicine Agency and European institution in general, because there is nothing more important than share knowledge and understanding, not only of the processes underpinning our decisions and our opinions, but also of the data and information that come in contact with us, and that we do want to put them at the disposal of researchers and scientists to foster new knowledge being generated. So all these measures, of course, is easy to say. It is harder to do. There are a lot of constraints and framework that we need to respect. But with this in mind, I think it's important that, and it's timely, that we conclude this workshop with this particular topic. And I give the floor to Fabio, who is sitting there, from the Commission, who is going to talk about transparency measures.
Thank you very much, Enrica. This session, will be me and Fergus, and will be a direct flow. We will talk about not only transparency of PAP, but also transparency on clinical trials, and what is going to change. We have already heard during the day that some changes are coming for the clinical trial following the entry into application of the new clinical trial regulation. And Fergus will tell you a little bit more on what is the situation, transparency of clinical trial now, and what is going to change in the future. I'm going also to give you a short overview of the content of the new clinical trial regulation that will be the impact for pediatrics and for children. We have heard during the day already something, but I'm going to explain you a little bit more, and to reply also what was said just before about the link on PAP and clinical trial. We know what is active and what is not active, and we can brainstorm about this. So about PAP, there are already quite a lot of information that is available on the EMA website. We have a list of all the PAP decisions, and it's possible to search and to look into it. For what concerns authorized medicines, we have at EU level a community register where it's possible to dig a lot of information, what is the status, and what if they are, how they are authorized, if they have market exclusivity or not. What is missing at this moment is a link between the two. So one easy fix could be to have in the community register a link to the PAP register with the link, and it's possible to go back for authorized medicine and to see if there is a PAP that has been authorized. We can also reflect what other document could be made available if it's useful following today's discussion. And one other thing that we could reflect for the future, it could be a link with the future clinical trial database when it will apply. I will tell you a little bit more in my next few slides. Going back to the clinical trial regulation, because we have heard quite a lot about this. Before going into the transparency, just to be clear, what the new regulation will bring forward. So we have already heard that this new regulation will modify the way clinical trials are authorized. I will not enter into how clinical trial will be authorized, but there will be one decision by member state. There will be collaboration between ethics committee and national competent authorities. What is important is that in the protocol there will be clearly the obligation to justify what are the inclusion and the exclusion criteria, and if an age group is excluded or underrepresented, there will need to be a justification. This is for the protocol, and let's remember that all the documents that are most of the documents that will be submitted for a clinical application will become public, as Fergus will explain when and how what will be the procedure. So this is quite important. There will be quite a new information that will become available in the future. Another new things about the assessment of a clinical trial application. So both the assessor and the ethics committee will have to take into account and to consult with pediatrician. There will need to be specific pediatric expertise in the clinical trial assessor, and the ethics committee will have to take into account the view of a lay person. That could be a patient or a patient association, and this is not always the case now, so that's also quite important. And what is also the other quite important news, as Anne-Marie Johnson-Lang has said before, is that in the authorization of a clinical trial, the existence of a PAP has to be considered. So the assessor will have to take into account if there is a PAP, and will be possible to clearly identify if a clinical trial is linked to a PAP or not. There are also specific rules for pediatric clinical trials, and these rules will make easier to conduct, should make easier to conduct a pediatric clinical trial. At least will be unified rules, and clear rules for all Europe. Will not be possible for most of the issue to have national rules. There will be still, we have heard before about discussion on us and consent. This will not be harmonized, but a lot of other the age of us and consent for the participating in a clinical trial, this will not be harmonized. It will still remain national, but for example, all the part on informed consent will be one. The information on patients will be one, and so will be a big progress. But let's focus now on transparency. As I was saying, transparency is a big improvement that the clinical trial regulation will bring about. All the information concerning a clinical trial application and the conduct of a clinical trial will be stored in a EU clinical trial database. And all the information that will be present in the EU clinical trial database, in principle, will become public. There are rules of when they will become public, and Fergus will explain in a moment when and how, but this will greatly improve what is the information that is about, and also the result of the clinical trial. So they will have a summary result and the conclusion of the clinical trial. So on one side will be very useful for the patient, because we'll know precisely which trials are ongoing, what are the population that are subject to the trial, if the trial real time is open for recruitment, and on the other side also for academics and also for companies that will know what is going on and what is already being studied, so to avoid also duplication on clinical trials. The cornerstone of the clinical trial regulation is this clinical trial database that EMA is developing in collaboration with the member state and the Commission, and Fergus can tell us a little bit more and specifically about transparency. And thank you very much, and I leave the floor to Fergus on this topic. Yeah.
So thank you very much, and good afternoon. My name is Fergus Sweeney, and I'm working here at EMA as Head of Division for Inspections and Human Medicines Pharmacovigilance. So to talk about transparency, and thank you, Fabio, for the lead in. So when we look at the clinical trial transparency, and in particular in developing our rules under the new clinical trial regulation, we set out a number of questions and have to ask ourselves, are we meeting these objectives? Because these are really the objectives we want to achieve. So first of all, have all clinical trials been publicly registered before they start? We need to ensure that every clinical trial in a human subject is publicly registered. I think that's a global ambition, but Europe has to contribute its full part to that. So this will be achieved. But why? So there is a public record of every trial, and people can come back afterwards and ask, well, what's happened to that trial? Has it been used in this or that way? Has it produced results? But also, patients, the public want to know, is there a trial in which I could participate, or in which my child could participate, or my patient? And again, having a public registry of those trials enables people to identify trials in a therapeutic area with a particular product, and do that also for children. And as often there are more challenges in that area. That's why we have the paediatric regulation in the first place. Perhaps diseases, rare diseases, it's more difficult to find solutions and clinical trials, and there are many unmet medical needs in that context, so finding a trial is very relevant. But also, what happened? What were the results of the trial that me or my child participated in? What was the outcome? Was it successful? Were there other findings? If there's been a marketing authorization, what results were used in deciding on that marketing authorization? Or if I'm prescribing a medicine, what is known about the medicine? I'd like to know more. I've got the package leaflet, the summary of product characteristics, but I want to look more. Is there more information there? We need to enable that. Can we review the data used to support the marketing authorization? Has the trial we are designing already been conducted? If you're a researcher, you don't want to duplicate, and it's a key objective of the pediatric regulation and the clinical trial regulation and making information public, is to avoid redundant duplication of trials, but also to learn from others and to progress innovation, to progress understanding, progress science, so that healthcare can progress. Were there problems with those trials? So we need to not just repeat the same problems several times, whether it's in trial design or safety or efficacy, dose ranging, whatever the issues were. And we need to strike the right balance to inform the public, protect public health, and foster the innovation capacity of European medical research, and then more globally leading with our transparency to ensure that that's more widely available. So I'm going to very briefly address 3 areas in which we make information on clinical studies available. So we've proactive publication of clinical study reports, which is something already happening. We have the EU Clinical Trial Register. Again, that's based on the current clinical trial database, and that's already happening. And then we have the Clinical Trial Regulation Portal and Database, which we are currently building, and I'll speak briefly on the rules for that. So this slide is a little bit full of acronyms, but there are 3 areas really in which information can be obtained. ATD is access to documents. So an individual person can apply to the agency and ask for access to particular documents, and then we'll process those and make them available, obviously in accordance with certain rules which are made public. But that really only provides it to that person or the party that they are working with, whether it's a patient association or a company or other group. The clinical data policy, our policy 70, as many know it, is our proactive publication. I think this is a really key initiative. It makes sure that we proactively publish the clinical reports and indeed other clinical data that have been submitted in marketing authorization applications, following the conclusion of the decision-making process on those applications. What's important to reference with this is that it applies irrespective of where in the world those trials were conducted. It applies to those marketing authorizations submitted to the European Medicines Agency, principally through the centralized procedure. We do it proactively, so nobody has to ask. We are working through publishing them as the decisions are made now, and so therefore including pediatric medicines and the decisions on those as part of that, and they're made available on our website. Now, the clinical trial regulation in the future will also include a requirement for all clinical studies included in marketing applications to be made public once the decision-making process on the marketing authorization has been completed. However, in that case, it relates to clinical trials which have been authorized or continued under the clinical trial regulations. So apart from other considerations, it will not be retroactive to older clinical trials, and it will not include clinical trials which are conducted uniquely outside of Europe. So all of them will have at least one investigator site in Europe. So the initiatives under the Policy 70 and the current clinical trial legislation, future clinical trial regulation are complementary, but one does not replace the other. And this will be publicly available proactively, again, in an EU database. So again, no need for anyone to request. Just as a very general, this is progress on 1 year of data with the clinical data publication. So there are 36 initial marketing authorizations involved, 18 extensions of indication, so 54 procedures published, and out of that we have 3,002 clinical studies, adding up to all of the documents adding up to 1.3 million pages of documents. So it's an accumulating body of information, of evidence for reference, which is already important, but will become more and more important as time goes on. Secondly, we have the EU Clinical Trial Register. This is established under the current Clinical Trial Directive. It was launched in March 2011. It contains information doesn't contain the protocol itself, but structured information about the study design, and then after the study, the results, related data for interventional trials started after May 2004, and again, with at least one investigator site in the EU. In this case, as with the future clinical trial regulation, this is not dependent on the marketing authorization status. This is all trials, whether many of these products never even come to market. So under the current legislation, the phase 2, 3 and 4 trials conducted in adults with at least one site in the EEA are made public, but all trials, phase 1, 2, 3 and 4, paediatric trials are made public, including phase 1 trials in adults that may be part of a PIP. So that's more broad, and that is made public once we have a decision from the competent authority and the ethics committee recorded in the EUDA-CT database, both of those being positive, and then it will be made public for adult trials, but in the case of pediatric trials, also if the trial doesn't proceed because of negative ethics committee opinion, that will also be made public. Pediatric trials outside of the EA that are part of an agreed PIP are also included. And this is what the website looks like, and as of when I made the slide, so it was a couple of weeks ago, we have information on 32,000 trials now, of which 5,000, just over 5,000 are in subjects or include subjects less than 18 years old, and we have information on a further 18,700 pediatric trials submitted under Article 45, and out of those we have information on the results already of 9,761 trials. So those are things which are already ongoing. The clinical trial regulation and portal and database we are building. There is a document on our website which describes the rules under which information will be public. Now, the premise of the clinical trial regulation is that all the information in the portal and database will be made public, with some exceptions, and those exceptions are the protection of personal data, and particularly of trial subjects, to protect commercially confidential information, in particular taking account of the marketing authorization status of the product, to protect the supervision of the trials, in other words, actions by the authorities in respect to the trials, where sometimes if you're conducting investigations, immediate publicity would not be appropriate. So those are the rules, and we had to practically translate that in, for the dozens of different data types and documents that are in the system. But the default is to make documents and data public at the first opportunity. All data and documents in the system will be made public, except for the manufacturing quality information, details of financial agreements, and specified personal data, and in particular that relates to patient data, obviously. The public registration of trials at their start, including all information needed for patients who may wish to participate in trials with therapeutic, diagnostic or preventive objectives, will be set out. And therefore, every trial will be notified publicly at its start, at the moment the decision has been made on the trial. The results of all trials will be made public, and this includes summary structured data. So learning on what we've done for UDRA-CT with some improvements, but a similar kind of structural data, but also a layperson summary. And this is a new innovation of the regulation. The Commission has recently finalised the guidance on the structure of that layperson summary, and so this is a very important initiative, and will make that much more accessible to the wider world, and also is in a more text context, whereas the structured data is structured data. And in the case of marketing applications, also the clinical study report once the marketing application decision process is agreed. Now, there's a possibility of justified deferral for a summary of results only in Category 1 trials, and what we call Category 1 are essentially the Phase 1 early development trials, up to a maximum of 30 months post-end of trial, and in fact that possibility of deferral does not apply to paediatric trials, so it would apply to adult trials but not paediatric trials. There's also an option to defer the publication of the IMPD, the Investigational Medicinal Product Dossier, Investigator Brochure, Protocol and Subject Information Sheet. If taken, that can be up to a maximum of 7 years for Category 1 trials, for the Phase 1 trials, 5 years for Category 2, which are essentially the so-called Phase 2-3 trials, the pre-authorization development trials. But in any case, once the marketing authorization decision has been taken, these will be made public even if it's less than that time. So whichever comes earlier will trigger the publication of any residual documents that are not already public. So to conclude, for clinical trials authorized in the EU EEA, we have a growing body of clinical trial information and result summaries in the clinical trial register. We have protocols and results for interventional trials since May 2004, trials starting since May 2004. And the new clinical trial regulation will provide even more extensive information building on that and really creating a very new paradigm, and I think world lead in terms of transparency, both within the depth of information provided and the range of trials it covers. And again, with the exception of the clinical study reports, which are obviously linked to the marketing authorization, all of the other information is made public irrespective of whether or not the product ever finally reaches the market. So we think transparency is really important because, first of all, it generates trust. If information is available, people can see what is being used by the regulatory system, but also what is being approved and authorized in terms of clinical trials in patients or indeed in healthy volunteers. It builds confidence because it helps everybody understand the system, how decisions are made, why decisions are made, what the basis of them is. And it empowers people because it gives you information. It helps you build knowledge so that you can make better decisions for yourselves, for the healthcare of your children, or for your patients. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fergus and Fabio, for this overview. And I open the floor for questions, comments, and discussion. Please.
My name is Angelika Jos, representing the industry. Thank you very much, Fergus and Fabio. I think from an industry perspective, we've fully supported transparency initiatives and we were very engaged in the discussions. And we're already investing a lot of resources in supporting, making sure that all this information is made available. We adopted principles for responsible clinical trial data sharing already in 2014. So I think that provides our commitment to this process. What I see at the moment is that there are differences in requirements and timelines for publishing data from pediatric trials compared to adult trials. And I wonder if there's any opportunity to harmonize, because that would really help us in achieving good compliance.
So on the particular point, we're working with the constraints of both the pediatric regulation on the one hand and the clinical trial regulation on the other. So the 6-month objective for pediatric trials is set under the pediatric regulation, and then the 12 months generally for trials under the clinical trial regulations. So opportunities for change. It's not something that we can do easily at this point. It's maybe something for the future, but I think at this stage we are building and operating the rules within the legal framework we have. And,
Just this was discussed with the co-legislator at the time when we were discussing the clinical trial regulation, and the co-legislator decided to keep the different system keep the timelines for the pediatric regulation as it is, and to have a different timeline for publication, the 12 months for the non-clinical trial non-involving children.
Please.
Yes, all these measures are very important for patients, and we were thinking about the possibility to create, as a transparency measure, also a label, a pediatric label for companies who are particularly involved in clinical trial, PIPs, all this, and could be a good idea for the company for communication also.
Thank you.
First of all, I think that the European agency should be really congratulated for all these measures. The amount of information on the website are extremely useful. During the Accelerate working group, there was a proposal that came up, which was to make, at the time of publication of the opinion on PIPs, to publish the key binding elements as well. Because clearly it will facilitate understanding how things are going on, and for the next one to figure out. And it was a proposal with several pharmaceutical representatives from pharmaceutical companies as well. So would the publication of key binding elements be, or could it be added to the opinion that is published by the European Medicine Agency about the PIP?
Will you? Yes.
You don't have to say yes or no now.
No, that's not the problem.
I think we might take it as one of the proposals. Okay, and
because we have been discussing this already. But
it's not an action point; it's a proposal.
No, but I think we'll take it seriously. Yes.
Any other comments, reflections, questions? Yep, Fabio.
If I just may, because one in a previous session was mentioned that often it's difficult to recruit children in a clinical trial because there is quite a lot of skepticism by the parents. And I think what Fergus has said, it's important to communicate about the transparency, that all the process for the clinical trial is quite transparent and will become even more transparent. So it's important that each of us in a small sphere of competence can communicate about this, so to reassure that is not where a parent is not putting his children in a black box or taking a decision, that there is oral procedure that is becoming more and more transparent, and this may be our information that will need to be communicated in a proactive way also at national level, and can help also to increase the confidence in all the system. This is something that can address also the issue of confidence in the system by the parents, because they will see also the opinion who is involved, that the decision is taken, and what is the outcome. So there will be a direct link. Yeah.
I'm sorry if I missed it, but is this in English only, or? No, sorry.
Fergus.
So if you refer specifically to the information under the clinical trial regulation, we will produce the user interface in official languages of the Union. The data content will depend on the language used by the sponsor, which will probably typically be in English or include English and the other official language which has been used in the clinical trial application. We've 4,000 to 5,000 clinical trials a year, and multiple documents and actions on those to have translation in all languages would be impossible. But the user interface and hopefully increasingly with time the search engine will respond to all languages.
Sorry, I might be a devil's advocate. It's just that having done this for about 15 years and actually taking regulations to patients and to clinicians. I don't think many people have actually been on the EMA website, and I think being quite interesting to see how we can disseminate that. And just being a devil's advocate, if you're going to put in lay language for children, especially and young people, you want them to access that. I think it's important to remember that the average reaching age in this country, for example, is 9 years of age. So we have to communicate everything we do to that level. And I think it's important when we talk about pediatrics to kind of remember that as well.
Also, we take your point, and there is a major effort at EMA to make our website more user-friendly and more able to actually communicate what we want to say. So, well, we've been having a couple of issues in terms of dedicating resources to something else, as you know. So we've been a bit delayed in our ambitions, but that doesn't make us less determined. So, and we have recently included in the website as an appetizer or tester some little movies, animation that explain the process of authorization and supervision of medicines. It's a step in the right directions. We know it's nowhere near what would be needed, but at least it testifies our awareness of this need. Any other questions, reflections? If not, in perfect timing, I pass the floor to my colleague Michael Bergden, and he will summarize a little bit the meeting, the workshop, having top-line conclusions and particularly next steps, because I'm sure most of you will be interested in knowing what happens next. So please, Michael.
Excellent. Thank you, Enrica. And I have now thanks, Florian, have the pleasure now to attempt to summarize a full-day workshop. Wow. No worries. I don't want to go through every single detail now. That would be a bit of a burden, I think, for everybody. But I would like to give a bit of a flavor of what we've heard today in these discussions. And I think maybe to start off with an impression of this exercise and an impression from the workshop. If I were to give a couple of adjectives, a couple of descriptions, what I felt today about the workshop, I would say it was definitely engaged. We brought a lot of stakeholders together who may normally not talk to each other in such a forum on these not just the issues, but the potential solutions and listening to each other in this space. It was a listening and learning exercise for many of us, I guess, and I think all of us can take home something which they may have not known before, and where I would call it horizon has been expanded, which is useful. It was definitely a cross-stakeholder dialogue today. And again, in the discussion, and particularly this morning, there was a lot of cross-stakeholder work and exchange. It was an intense day. It was focused, I would say, but also concrete, and I would also say very relevant. So with this description of overall impression, just to remind us briefly of why we've been here today, and it was basically to have a multi-stakeholder exchange on how to better apply the existing legal framework. We were reminded this morning by one of the co-chairs, by Florian, that we would like to optimize the application implementation of the framework, and that's the scope of the discussion today. We had a lot of listening and common understanding in scope. We were finding out solutions for improvements, but also it was with the intention to develop a shared vision. And I remember Enrica this morning saying that we should come out here with very concrete examples, with very concrete actions, and listen to each other. And I think that I would say we have achieved with concrete actions proposed, but also loads of information, also documented on slides, and we'll come to this in a minute, which we will need to analyze even further. It's definitely a joint workshop as a crucial step for the development of a concrete plan to address the challenges identified previously. And in this regard, the way of working today, really across different parties, was, I believe, very, very helpful. Now, we had 3 different topics where we had intense discussion and 2 where we were more focusing on information sharing, I would say. And if I were just to focus in my high-level summary on these 3 key areas about the needs, about something that has been completed, and about the paperwork, then these were the areas which we have addressed in this space. And allow me just to give a little high-level summary which doesn't go into the detail which has been produced by the individual rapporteurs from each of the session. But when it comes to the experience and ideas regarding criteria and methodologies that could be used to identify disease conditions of unmet pediatric medical need, I guess what I found extremely stimulating here was to hear the various perspectives which really did enrich the discussion by not just focusing on listing and how to create criteria for listing, but very strong focus on stakeholder engagement. So we had I would call it in 3 different buckets, what has been discussed this morning. One was to identify areas of pediatric need, to identify topics. We heard about the difference in additional evidence for established substances vis-à-vis the needs for innovation support, which is different in itself. We heard about some criteria of disease burden as an example. We heard that we should use existing reports to really generate from there learning, but also to clear out where there is no need and one shouldn't necessarily focus on. So a quite broad spectrum. And all this led intuitively to the next bucket, which was around cross-stakeholder engagement, multi-stakeholder engagement as the key. There was a very strong voice for a patient-centric discussion, and that's really something which lingered through several times in terms of needs, but also in terms of demonstrating of quality of life. There were 7 references being made, and many other aspects. There was also a discussion on the need to reach out to downstream decision makers, as we like to say, so HTAs, payers, etc., in this context. There was the role of different existing groups highlighted. We heard about ERNs and the role of ERNs in their stakeholder fora. We heard about focus group. We heard about existing discussions which might be then enriched with other industry participants, for example, or additional patient representatives wherever they are not currently engaged. And I think that was a very important point to hear. And of course, we heard, and there were several references being made throughout the day about the strategy fora, which have been established initially for the area of pediatric oncology, but there was really a vision that this could be a framework which could be useful also for other areas. It cannot be used for everything because it's quite resource intense, but we need to really see this as an opportunity, as a learning where this can be used appropriately. The 3rd bucket in this very first item was for me the discussion around data, because that was extremely relevant. It was data in terms of data standards, data coding, data collection, data aggregation, all this to support discussions about unmet needs. And again, this was very well highlighted by many of the colleagues. It was the use of different data sources that was very much highlighted. Again, for the discussion of the need. There was a focus on registries in some areas, but also the use of existing data, again, came back again. Let's use what's existing already and analyze it more. And of course, in this context, and also the need for data sharing. So a couple of themes, which I've just tried to capture now, which I heard through this session on topic 1 about the pediatric needs and methodology. Now, in session 3, which was about the ideas on measures to proactively address obstacles to timely completion of PIPs, there again we heard a couple of ideas, and again, if I try to cluster it a bit around certain themes, there was a theme around planning, right? Planning requires the engagement with patients, for example, in terms of study design, in terms of identifying of needs. We come back to this early discussion. Planning also in terms of preparedness. We heard about some work which is ongoing, some guidance being established in order to ensure trials are ultimately being conducted. We heard about planning in terms of adjustment to science, right? A different aspect where it came to the need to constantly update plans, and we come to this also in the subsequent session. So all of this really in the context of how do we best prepare. Again, here, a very strong point also on education and training. Education and training in terms of various patient representatives. We're calling for this to be rolled out even wider. Site preparedness, I heard in some of the discussions today's, etc. But most striking, I guess, from this session was what I would call the third bucket around collaboration and work across different decision makers in this space. And we had a very long discussion around the plan on the one hand, and the need to ensure that trials are finding their uptake through clinical trial application processes and ethics committee later. So the work here with CTFG and the opportunity here to engage in this space, I think is very welcome. And there was a training need identified, there was an exchange of information being seen as an option, and I think that's something which we should follow up if I just listen to the discussion today, because it was one of these obstacles which had been identified. And I think the new framework, which was also then highlighted at the very end now with the clinical trial regulation, its implementation, and the harmonization of rules across member states is supporting this work. So certainly something which I would call now the right time to dive in and really to move from here. The third big area for discussion was, I would call it the more paperwork process discussion, the operational challenges in relation to pediatric procedures and exchange of ideas for process improvement. Now, admittedly, this was a discussion which was maybe not so exciting for everybody, if I can say. We also had not that many panelists here, but that's naturally coming in. And in a way, it's something which we really need to address. We need to address also administrative hurdles if they exist. And therefore, we had to have this discussion. I'm really grateful to have a very good industry perspective and a very good academia perspective, because they were complementary, and you could also easily see that there are sometimes slightly different needs. And also there was a mentioning that academia might need more support in certain areas if they would like to send in a PRP and follow the process accordingly. So a very specific piece which we need to take up. But we had discussions around process and documentation as one big bucket here, discussion throughout the process, key binding elements, can they be revisited in their complexity, compliance check, pre-submission interactions, just to name a few. And we had the discussion around data and evidence. We had the progressive build of a PRP, which was a very strong voice and mentioned several times. The standards for established substances in view of later PUMAs. And again, funding was also coming up in this context. So we had a number of themes here, which again do serve really as a basis for a concrete action plan. Now, where do we go from here? After all this day of engaged work, of intense discussion, and of, I think, learning a lot from and about each other, the next step will be, of course, and we heard it so much today, in its importance of transparency of the work we've done today. We need to record what's happening today, but also we need to ensure continuous engagement. The first step, of course, is that we will need to produce a high-level report from this workshop, as we normally do, where we will aim to summarize the various positions been taken today, the ideas put forward today, and also the next steps we would like to take. So a high-level report from the workshop should be published in May, or by May, I should say. together also with the slides, the presentations from today, because again, these are a very important record of the discussion today. It was mentioned in some of the presentations there's far more granularity on the slides, and I would say that was appreciated because it allows us to go through once more and to really go and pick them into more detail and to see really what can we take from there into the concrete actions. We will then go away and develop this action plan, which will be an action plan shared by the European Commission and the EMA together with the PDCO, which we need to work out based on the input we have received from all the stakeholders, focusing really on actions which are in scope of improving the implementation of the existing legislation. We have heard maybe a couple of suggestions today which may go beyond, which we again need to capture through the report, but which may not go into an action plan in this space, but they need to be addressed somewhere else, and we need to find the right place for these. But we will definitely come up with an action plan by mid-2018, which is expected to be an action plan that is covering a roughly 2-year period. That's what we envisage, and it does fit into some of the discussions and proposals which we have heard today, and will be informed by the proposals we have seen and by the voices we have heard today. We will then need to report about the progress with the action. We will need to find fora where we, of course, do a reporting about the achievements and the progress with these actions, and we would like to do this action specific, so in the right context. We would also like to say that this action plan is not once for all then cast in stone once it's out there. It needs to be a continuous exercise in itself, meaning whatever we learn from certain activities, we can then also fine-tune over time. So it is really something where we would like to see continuous engagement. Overall, though, and I think this is really a very big take-home message for today, there is an expectation that all stakeholders need to contribute to boosting development of medicines in children. And I think the discussion today has very clearly shown how important it is that all stakeholders do take their part, all stakeholders do take their responsibility, do whatever it's in their remit in order to fulfill this particular mission, and therefore to address what's in scope of the discussion today, the needs of the children in Europe. With this, I would like to thank everybody for their contribution, for all the well-elaborated thoughts in the beginning, for all the preparation which has gone into it, for all the participants, speakers. I would like to thank colleagues from the EC and from EMA for their hard work in organizing this workshop, bringing all these colleagues together, 160 people in the room, many people broadcasted here. I would like to thank everybody who made themselves available today here to come to London, but also those colleagues who are listening in by the broadcast which we have had during the day today, and who were following this discussion with interest. And with this, I would like to hand back to the co-chair, to Florian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this perfect summary of the day. Putting in 15 minutes what has been discussed over the day was a challenge, but it has been nicely done. I would also like to thank the agency for having organized this workshop, recognizing all the work which was done prior to the meeting to make it really a useful meeting, to make it a successful meeting. A lot of preparation has gone into this. I would like to thank the panelists and you as an audience for contributing to the day. My commissioner said this morning in his video message he wants to see concrete actions after that day, and I think we have a plate of full with ideas of actions we can implement in the next 2 years, and this action plan, which will now be develop will be testament to that. With that, I would like to close the workshop and wish you a safe trip home, and obviously there will be a continued discussion with all of you in the future. Thank you very much.